Never used to have shoes separately. I didn't sleep very well. Old age sickness and death.
Those people with drinking problems. Ja, met bacon. I just try to maintain the Okay, well now we have a chance for questions and answers and dialogue, and all questions are welcome, especially if you're new and especially if you're thinking, oh, well, I shouldn't ask that, that's obvious. So, yeah, Corey.
You were talking about meditation posture during for the meditation, and I know that it's important to do that before the meditation, but then let's say you wake up or whatever, realize you've been distracted, and you also can tell that your posture's not that kind of posture.
Yes.
Do you try and quickly redo your posture at the same time, or do you only check in and fix your posture at the beginning?
I've done it both ways
Okay.
for a long time. Probably the more common thing, though, is if my body's that way, usually my mind's that way too.
Yeah.
And it's actually easier to get my body back in the right posture than my mind usually gets back in the right posture. But I have experimented with trying to move as little as possible. At least when my mind is awake and alert, I found that to be a really interesting thing to see how how having a sort of stable, unmoving body, how powerful a support that can be. If your mind is alert. If your mind's dull, then I think probably better to sit up straight.
Okay.
I just have an observation. Sometimes going for refuge, I have a hard time envisioning all sentient beings, but after yesterday's marches across the world, it felt really easy. It felt like everybody was there, and, maybe not quite all sentient beings, but a lot of them.
Yeah.
And it was kind of powerful.
Yes. So let's see. I noticed my note here. So the first question is about when you notice you're distracted, do you adjust your posture and move, or do you stay still and just bring your mind back? And then Pat had an observation about the power of observing all of the people who were involved in the marches yesterday, and the value of that in visualizing all sentient beings. Yeah, one of the really delightful aspects of the election is all of the good people who will be doing good things. Whereas if the election had turned out differently, most of them would probably still be asleep.
On that theme of using those visuals to think about, kind of broaden all sentient beings, the New York Times Online had a continuous scroll yesterday of pictures coming in from all kinds of countries and every city that had it, so it even expanded more. It was like women in Iraq and in Africa, and I mean, it was like really, so it wasn't just the US, which was huge, but a lot of countries. So if you might want to take a quick look at that, the New York Times Online, and you just get these visuals scrolling by from people sending them in from cities all over the world.
The Oregonian was in Antarctica, and I was thinking, all these little penguins, sentient being penguins.
Yeah, there were these really remote places with like 6 or 7 men and women standing there with their little signs. It was very
30 some in Antarctica. But
Wow.
they did put signs by some of the seals and things. Expand their
all sentient beings. It's joyous.
I like the focus today, refuge, and how the exercises that we can do as adults to find refuge within ourselves. As a 5th grade teacher in a very multi-ethnic school system, Centennial School, I'm wondering what would you recommend, how I can practice that with my students. And we have circles. Every morning we talk about the election, we talked about, I even showed the inauguration based on the recommendation from my principal, who's a person of color. But I know that some of my students, especially my students whose parents are from Mexico, they have voiced their fears of the new president deporting their parents. So, and I think on days like that, when a teacher hears the conversation, would be a good day for me to gather my students on the carpet and then speak to them in a very gentle way like you have, and also have them close their eyes, so that they can just quiet their mind down. So what I would like to know, if you have materials that I can use. And there are schools, I mean, this is not uncommon. There are schools within our countries that have practiced this type of meditation and without any religion, so.
So I'm not going to do justice to the question, but
Repeat the question.
yeah, I'm going to try. We have a 5th grade teacher who's asking about sharing meditation or perhaps mindfulness with her 5th grade students. And she brought up that her principal encouraged them to watch the inauguration, and that she'd heard from some of her Mexican students, their parents' fears that their parents could be deported by the new president. I think I don't feel well. I'll share with you my thing from Mr. Rogers.
I love Mr. Rogers.
We all love Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, wow, talk about
Even though I couldn't
Powerful.
understand what Mr. Rogers said when I was growing up in Samoa, I just love the gentleness of thinking of the and the puppets and
yeah. Let's see if I can find it. If I can't find it, I can remember it. So, yeah, there he is. And I have a picture of him like holding his shoes, you know. How he'd always change his shoe into his tennis shoes whenever he would come home. So, Mr. Rogers says anything that's human is mentionable. And anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. He says when we talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. And the people we trust with that important talk can help us know that we are not alone. So that seems like what you're talking about. Like, how do I make these concerns mentionable? And how can I help my students who are worrying about these things feel less alone? Now, as to the method or how to teach meditation to a group of fifth graders, I'm going to have to plead ignorance. My sense, though, is that the teaching them meditation may not be the right way to go, doing it directly, but rather maybe asking them to use their imagination and imagine a place and use that sort of a short guided visualization because of course they have great imaginations, like that they're better at that probably than we are. And in fact, there's a lot of things that they're probably better at than we are. I remember when my daughter was that age, she didn't really need to do meditation in order to be more present. She was mostly present most of the time because, you know, life was good when you're in fifth grade. And so if I would try to, you know, get her to sit, and she came here to the kids program for many years, you know, like that was hard. And she thought that meditation was hard. But the rest of the time she seemed quite present. So I think that's just thinking out loud here from a place of not knowing, is giving them something, a common thing that they can put their minds on for a short time. You know, it doesn't need to be a long time at all. But if they can all be thinking about the same thing at the same time, then you can feel it when you sit in here, right? When everybody's mind is sort of going in the same direction. There's kind of a field that's created that supports your being present, and it's quite pleasant, and the kids will maybe feel that. And of course, I would invite anybody who has more experience with teaching mindfulness to children to chime in.
I don't have more experience, but I know that one of our sister Dharma centers, one of our sister Dharma centers, KSC in Ashland, Kagyu Sukha Chuling. I know they have quite a developed children's program, and they had worked with Julia here also, who did some things, and so I think they have some documented resources that they would be willing to share. And then I also think I know that Alan Wallace has worked with people in schools in California doing. They've done mindfulness meditation and to help with stress levels and things in kids in schools, and maybe, and even teachers too. So, so you might just suggestions to look first. I think there are resources.
Isn't Julia's curriculum still online?
Yeah, we have it. I
Pugu?
can,
And there's that
I can
too.
give you
Yeah.
that through WordPress. There's lots of those kind of resources. You can just Google them, literally 5th grade mindfulness training, you're going to get 1,000. And then the question is sorting. But one thing I noticed when your question came, as soon as you said Mexican parents being deported, my heart just went like that. And in some fear and possibly some anger. And I remembered a thing that Erick's done with us over and over, and it's so simple but so powerful. When something difficult comes up in here, he just says, let's take a minute and everybody be quiet and go inside and see how you feel. So this could be done with these children. I mean, that wouldn't be objectionable to anyone. You know, one of the kids brings up the fear, you listen and then say, wow, let's all be quiet for a minute and see what comes up for us, and then talk. And I just have found that simple, straightforward, very potent. Like as soon as that I went inside and went, whoa, my heart just went like got squeezed, you know. In fear and empathy, you know, and concern. And so I think if we just do that over and over, like come back to our experience and then share that, it can be pretty simple, but it's very supportive to the person bringing up the thing.
I just wanted to add a little something. I grew up in Southern Oregon, and I would add to Dora's idea, if you might make contact with the Sangha down in Ashland. They have a very large Hispanic community in Southern Oregon, and so there may be some additional kind of support for you and ideas with specific reference to those kinds of things.
Good website too.
Yes. Yes.
Hi. So I'm thinking, it's kind of interesting because you wonder if it's fully about Buddhism or appropriate, but I'm thinking about what you're talking about with your students, and I have a son. So I went to the march yesterday, and I asked my son if he wanted to come, and he said no, and I said, that's okay, but we're going to talk about it later. And so I'm thinking about this funny balance of, I'm trying to tell him what is alarming and what is scary out there, and some of the actual events that have happened that are offensive or are feel illegal or attack women, or a funny balance between trying to educate him, but then you think about Buddhism and you think about being compassion and being kind in an environment too where, even though it was a peaceful march, this balance of sharing all of this really tough news with our kids and trying to guide them in a way so that they know why we're so appalled, and why something is so horrifying that someone would say or do, but then to move forward in a way that doesn't scare them or doesn't, so one example is I told him we might lose our health insurance. And so he said, well, what will happen if we lose our health insurance? And then I talked through what would happen there, if we would or if we wouldn't. But these little details that there's this big landscape that's just hard and weird to navigate as an adult, and it feels kind of awful out there right now, but then I'm thinking about how to talk about it with my son in terms of educating but not creating fear, and trying to show him how to respond in a way when the climate has really changed in terms of how safe we feel or optimistic, how optimistic we feel.
I have one more thought,
Oh,
and that kind of going on with Sophie's idea of sitting with, being aware and going inside with the feeling with a group of kids. And I think one of the key issues is that you're not alone in this. And one of the nice things about a practice like that is to experience not being alone with it here and now with this group of people, but also building that skill for not being alone, no matter where you are. And I think that's some of the value of parents talking with their kids about difficult issues. So, as a parent or as an adult, one is able to open into the feeling oneself. One then helps digest that for the child. And the child gets to experience the modeling of being able to carry big feelings. It's all part of the mindfulness practice.
now I know how the interpreters feel.
I don't think we should repeat every comment because
Well, I
Just the question.
I do need to.
there is a microphone.
Oh, okay. All right. Well,
Oh,
that
it doesn't
makes me
work.
feel.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
That's-
thought those were working.
Yeah, I don't.
Never mind.
Well, the question was about how to share what's going on with in the world with your child, and maybe balancing truth-telling with also not wanting to cause alarm. And then there was the comment that Bonnie made was about the value of being able to share things in a way that people don't feel alone in the situation. And well, for some reason it's reminding me of the traditional teaching on dana, or generosity. And I'm not going to get this exactly right, but they say there's sort of three things that you can give. And one is sort of maybe what we usually think about conventional support or material goods or emotional support. The sort of whole range of ways that we can be generous to each other. And the second is sharing the Dharma as a form of generosity. And the third, well, it's the way, I like the way that Joan Halifax puts it. She calls it giving the gift of no fear. And that's something that comes up a lot in my work, because I'm dealing with people who are in pretty dire situations, and there's always this question of how much should we tell them? You know, how do we balance being honest about what is happening versus causing such alarm or making it difficult for them to really live and interact with their lives. And I think intuitively you have already sort of grasped the most important thing that I've learned or that I practice, which is that I ask people, you know, like, how much do you want to know about this? And I think in asking your son, you know, do you want to go? And allowing him to say no, and saying, okay, but we will talk about this later. You're giving him some control over the information. And you're demonstrating in doing that you are trustworthy. I think that's a very trustworthy thing. And if we're with people that we can trust, it makes it a lot easier, makes it possible sometimes to look at things that are scary that we would otherwise rather not think about. So what we tell, you know, we have parents all the time ask this question. They have some terrible illness and they want to know, well, how, you know, what should we tell our kids about this, or how much should we tell them? And I'm not, this is obviously a different situation, but it's not that different. It's scary stuff and uncertainty. And one thing that we tend to tell parents is we tell them, well, we know you know your kids the best. And you know sort of how much they can, you know, when's the right time and those kind of things. You have instincts around those and you can trust those. But we encourage them to also wonder, well, if you don't talk to them about this, and are they, you know, what are they already thinking? Like, what's already in there? And in some cases, you know, with President Trump, there may not be anything in there, or there may be things that they've gotten from the media, or ideas that they've heard from their friends or at school. But sometimes a place to start is even, well, what do you understand about the situation that's going on? You know, what have you heard? And my 13-year-old would say, yeah.
That's right.
But at the same time, I can tell she's interested. You know, she thinks that, because she can tell everybody's all has an opinion on the subject.
Or a pink hat.
Yeah, or a pink hat, or a sign in their front yard, or a bumper sticker, or something,
Confederate flag.
or a Confederate flag.
It's all there.
It's all
there.
Yep, it's all there. I think that's what I have to say about that.
I guess I would just, I think that's, you're a parent, I think my experience with my son when he was 13 and now 41 giving me feedback, which is quite good. Sometimes painful, but not always. It's just, I think when my fear, which I wasn't dealing with, would spill over into my wish he had all this information, as though this information was going to protect him. And it didn't. It didn't scare him either. He just thought, what? So I think the thing would be available, make it open that there's a lot going on right now. You might hear things at school. If you want to talk about it, I'm here. And or ask questions like, I went to the march, to the Women's March. It was really amazing to me, or whatever it was. And do you want to talk about it? And usually they say no. But they are hearing things. They're way in the world. So the idea that we're going to protect them, it doesn't happen. I mean, I remember when he was 6, he came home and told me he couldn't hug his boyfriend anymore because they were gay, and he didn't want to be called gay. He didn't know what gay was, but he could tell it was a bad thing he was being called on the playground for hugging his friend. So I was like, 6 years old, now we have to deal with homophobia. And it's like, okay, And then, I mean, all kinds of things that if you make yourself available, they will tell you. So I think it's about, I just want to emphasize what Erick said, make yourself a safe place for them. And your practice will get your fear out of the way. And then the place is safer. If they don't see any space, like my son's main feedback is, you were too anxious. And I say, you're right. I wanted to protect you from everything. And it took me a long while to see. I mean, that's a great impulse. I wanted to protect you from every single harm. But you can't do it.
I think what's interesting is it feels really groundless because it does feel very uncertain.
We're uncertain. We can't
Right.
give them certainty when it's in fact uncertain. And pretend certainty makes us all anxious.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said something.
Yeah, the kind of they're there, it's going to be okay.
They're
It's,
there.
it's like, no, it's not. It never has been, and it won't be. There have always been things going wrong, and we've lived in a bubble where it's even the bad stuff that goes on in our society, which is bad. It's truly bad. And shouldn't go on, but it's not as bad as what goes on in other circumstances where things have really completely fallen apart. And as we're talking about this, I actually don't know what to say to a 5th grader myself. I'm definitely not smarter than a 5th grader, or is it a 3rd grader, whatever the TV show is. I'm definitely not smarter. I'm not smart enough for that. But I think, as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about a couple of things that came up. And one of them is, Colin Rinpoche was once asked kind of what to do. Somebody was saying, like, my family really doesn't, and my friends really don't like me being a Buddhist, and I'm really afraid. And they might kill me. And he said, oh, well, sometimes they do. And you think about it, that was the Tibetan experience. Really bad things do happen, and we can't actually say, no, they're not going to happen. So then the question of one of the very first points that you brought up was about refuge, and that sense of and Erick's mention of the Kim McLeod's point about we are refugees from our habitual patterns. And if we look at the example of how many Tibetans survived that, the ones that did survive, how they spiritually survived that, there's some lessons to be taken from that. It's not. I wish that we didn't have challenges like this. I wish that sentient beings did not have challenges like this. But we could be faced with many things, with people with their parents taken away, with other kinds of things that could arise. So actually finding that kind of deep refuge in ourselves is a critical thing. And it's we usually don't have to rely on that. Because so many things, we live in a very complex society and economy where a lot of things come together, and stuff that in a more, you could say, primitive, a more sustenance-oriented economy, very, very in your face. If we don't have this, it doesn't work anymore. And no water. I remember seeing a film with somebody asking this nomad family, well, what would happen if you lost your yaks? And they said, oh, well, we'd go find them. And then they said, no, I mean, you lost them, like they were, oh, we'd starve. And there wasn't a bunch of like having to think about it. And for us, the things like, well, we would lose our health insurance and these kinds of things, and some of us would die, not everybody, but the number of people who would die because of that will go up. It's much more diffuse, and so it's harder than saying we lose our yaks, we die. But those kinds of things, at some point, things can unravel to a point where it is like that. So how do we put our finger on that fundamental deep refuge that allows us to go through these kinds of experiences? I don't have a recipe for how to do it, just kind of generically, because we all begin from a very, very individual spot. I certainly would not have a generic recipe for how to speak to a child. But just in the practice of meditation, one of the things that we can discover, and this is that we're not actually trapped by the last thought that arose in our mind. We're not actually trapped by that. And it's kind of a subtle point at one level. But if it's really a matter of we're just going to lose our ability to relate to anything or not, it's not such a subtle point. If we're going to lose our ability to actually hold others with kindness, with some clarity, be able to engage within discernment in our world and in our circumstances, it's not such a subtle point. And in the moment, it feels kind of like, well, okay, I was thinking about my lunch and I decided, oh, I better get back to my meditation. It doesn't actually say, well, okay. But really, if we're really lost in our patterns, we do not have freedom. And that being able to discover that is something that is very important. And if we can, to the extent that we can actually demonstrate some of this skill, this capacity in our own life, in our own way of relating, maybe that's the thing that, if I was to offer a prescription to be able to cultivate that and show that and own that we're cultivating that with those that are around us. Maybe that's something that can contribute. I can't protect you by saying everything's going to be okay. I can't protect you by kind of saying, you know, we'll all figure out how to fix it all. But I can offer some example of how to relate to this in a way that I'm not as trapped as I used to be.
And if I put it in a kind of bumper sticker for parents, what I've found out, and it's really for everyone, but that special relationship with your children is the best thing you can do for them is your practice, because your practice will show you where you're stuck, and as you unstick, space is there and your modeling is there, and kids are watching what we do, not what we sit them down and say. They're really watching what we do. Our friends are watching what we do. Our students are watching what we do. It's experiential. So that's what I learned, and I think it helps me with the grandkids.
I have one last little piece. Again, along the line of not feeling isolated. And it's this image of all of the people.
We can't hear you, Bonnie.
All of the people coming together in the march with goodwill. And I found that, and also the recollection of being connected to all beings is quite helpful in facing the difficulty of traumatic situations. So I think that for kids now, that's actually quite a gift that we have this positive image as well in the midst of such adverse circumstances.
And in pediatrics, if I learned one thing, it's that kids are a lot more resilient than we would like to think. And they can deal with an awful lot as long as they don't sense that we're hiding from them or we're being dishonest with them. But if they know that we support them, they can deal with an awful lot, and they can do it very well. And a lot of them can deal with it better than we as adults can.
I think that's true. They
know
don't
that's
have
true.
as
I know
many
that's true.
they don't have as many decades invested in things being kind of the way that we've got them arranged to
Screwed up.
defend it. Yeah.
I like the refuge and safe place. And for many of our students, the school is a safe place
Yeah.
for them. And then for our children, our home is a safe place. So I have a plan for tomorrow. I'm going to go over the term refuge. And then I'm going to ask my students, how many of you are refugees? I have a student who's a refugee from Iraq. And I have Laotian students and Vietnam students whose parents and grandparents were refugees. And then we will talk about what the term means. And then I'm going to have them close their eyes. And then I'm going to tell them, picture a safe place, a place of refuge that you go to. And not very long, because the attention span is very short. And so, and then they're going to ask me, how long, Mrs. Bennett? And I'm going to say 60 seconds. And then they're going to, so anyhow, and then I'm going to have them close their eyes and picture a refuge, a safe place. And then when they open their eyes, they're going to turn to the person next to them, because they love to talk, and they're going to share, and then they will share with the whole group.
Yay.
And then I'll report back to our community next Sunday.
Can we come?
Please come. I tell my
Sounds so
friends,
good.
please come. I tell my friends in Eastmoreland, if you want to see a bunch of brown people like me, and my students come to Centennial School District, Oliver Elementary. I think 60% of our population are people of color and immigrants and refugees. So one of the things I told my students, I said, I'm upset just like you are because I'm a refugee. And some of my family members from the islands and from Mexico are also very worried. But I think the key to talking to children who have fears is compassion and letting them know that you understand, that you also are worried and you understand how they feel. But it was very, very hard when my students were crying after the election. And that was something that, anxiety, but compassion was the key for me to talk to my students. Everybody was quiet when these two boys were crying. And then the children are looking at me. But it was a time for me to be silent as well and to search for the right words to comfort the children. And so this has been a blessing for me to come here because I have to deal with the anxiety and the worries of my students this week after the election. And there will be a lot of questions about why were people marching here in Portland and all around the country and even around the world. I mean, my people down in New Zealand and Australia were also protesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So, dedicate the merit.
By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.
There is a neon training today at 11:30. Margaret's leading it.
Here.
So if you can stay, and is there, do you have room for any more people if they want to stay?
I do. You're welcome to stay.
Okay.
It'll take about 30 minutes. I'll just give you a tour and answer any questions.
It's quick, it's simple, it's delightful.
It's a great way to get your user ID.
Yeah.
Still on?